just science fiction retrospectives. It's this one. The premise itself is classic Trek. The Enterprise respond to a call for medical help and find a tiny, isolated society of telekinetic beings who model their culture on ancient Greek philosophy, right down to togas and Platonic ideals. But these Platonians aren't the noble philosopher kings they pretend to be. They're bored, powerful, and cruel, and they quickly turn Kirk, Spock, and the rest of the landing party into playthings, using their mental powers to force the crew to dance, grovel, and humiliate themselves for entertainment. Buried inside that cruelty is the scene the episode is remembered for, using their telekinesis. The Platonians force Captain Kirk and Communications Officer Uhura to move toward each other against their will and kiss on camera, a moment that became one of the first interracial kisses ever broadcast on American primetime television. It's a small, almost throwaway few seconds of screen time within a much darker episode, but its cultural weight was enormous. Here's the part that surprises a lot of people. NBC itself wasn't a network dragging its feet over the scene. Executives were far more anxious about how affiliate stations across the Deep South would react once the episode reached local airwaves, and there was real internal debate about whether some stations would simply refuse to run it. In the end, the backlash many executives feared largely didn't materialize. Audience complaints were minimal, and the moment is now remembered as a landmark rather than a scandal, a sign that American viewers in 1968 were more ready for that step forward than network suits gave them credit for. The reaction overseas told a different story. When the episode crossed the Atlantic for broadcast in the United Kingdom, the BBC simply chose not to air it. Publicly, the network's justification wasn't about race or romance at all. It was filed under the same reasoning used for a handful of other Star Trek episodes, citing unpleasant and excessive content involving cruelty, humiliation, and psychological torment inflicted on the crew by their captors. Many fans and historians who studied the decision since have pointed out that the Platonians' campaign of degradation against the landing party, forcing Kirk to slap himself, forcing him and Spock to grovel and be whipped for entertainment, forcing a dancer named Marta through a suggestive performance meant purely to titillate her captors, was arguably a more plausible reason for the ban than the kiss itself, though plenty of people at the time and since have suspected that discomfort with an interracial kiss was quietly part of the calculation too. Either way, the episode wasn't shown on British terrestrial television until the 1990s, decades after an original American broadcast. That's a fascinating pattern already. An episode remembered today for a moment of progress was simultaneously too intense, too cruel, and too uncomfortable for a national broadcaster to show its own audience. And it's not even the harshest example on this list. Let's talk about the episode the BBC itself once singled out by name as its most extreme case. Picture routine cargo run gone catastrophically wrong. The Enterprise is simply delivering experimental treatment for violent insanity to Elba 2, a remote and heavily secured Federation facility that houses the criminally insane. Patient considered too dangerous for any ordinary hospital. It should be a quick stop. It is not. By the time Kirk and Spock beam down, the inmates have already seized full control of the asylum, and the man running the show is Garth Vizar, once was Starfleet's most celebrated and decorated captains, a man whose tactical brilliance was once held up as a model for cadets to study. That career ended when Garth was horribly injured and subjected to alien medical experimentation that left him a master shapeshifter and, more dangerously, completely unmoored from reality. He now believes with total conviction that he is destined to conquer and rule the galaxy, and he has both the delusion and the shape-shifting ability to attempt it. Garth doesn't just hold Kirk and Spock captive when they arrive. He toys with them, impersonating the facility's own chief medical officer at first. He manipulates the situation from the inside, while quietly plotting to seize the Enterprise itself. Once his identity is exposed, the episode drops any pretense of a rescue mission, and becomes something closer to a psychological siege. Garth subjects Kirk to repeated humiliation and torment specifically designed to break his will and prove his own dominance. And in one particularly brutal moment, he murders a fellow inmate in cold blood for no reason beyond demonstrating that he can. It's a scene meant to be shocking, and it succeeds. There's no real narrative justification offered, just naked cruelty used as a display of power. The episode's climax turns into a genuinely tense identity puzzle. Garth uses his shape-shifting to impersonate Kirk perfectly, right down to mannerisms and voice, leaving Spock with the task of figuring out NCE between them. Bele is black on his right side and white on his left, while Lakai is the exact mirror image. To the Enterprise crew and to the audience, that distinction looks completely meaningless. To Bele and Lakai, it's worth killing and dying over. The episode is blunt almost to the point of being uncomfortable, precisely because that was the point. It wasn't censored or banned outright in most markets, but it drew mixed reactions for being so direct about its message that some critics felt it abandoned the subtlety the franchise usually prided itself on, while others considered that bluntness exactly what the subject demanded. Either way, it stands as one of the clearest examples of Roddenberry's original strategy in action. Take a real, ugly human conflict, transplant it onto an alien species, and let the absurdity of the alien version force the audience to confront the absurdity of the real thing. For a franchise that spent so much of its history running into censors, Star Trek has also spent an enormous amount of time collecting recognition from critics and institutions. The Hugo Award for Best Dramatic Presentation, one of the most respected honors in science fiction, has a history closely tied to the original series. In 1967, 3 of the 5 nominees for the award were Star Trek episodes, and the following year, all 5 nominees came from the show, with one ultimately taking home the prize. That pattern of recognition continued decades later with Star Trek, The Next Generation picking up Hugo Awards of its own in the 1990s, while Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, and more recent series like Discovery and Lower Decks have all earned nominations of their own. The film side of the franchise has its own long list of honors. Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, one of the most commercially successful entries in the film series, earned multiple nominations at the Saturn Awards a year it was released, alongside for nominations at the Academy Awards for its cinematography, sound work, and score. Decades later, the 2009 reboot film brought the franchise its first competitive Academy Award win, taking home the Oscar for Best Makeup and Hairstyling. Proof that a show built in the 1960s could still be winning industry recognition more than 40 years after it first went off the air. Television honors followed a similar arc. The Next Generation earned a Peabody Award in the late 1980s for a first-season episode that critics singled out for setting a new standard quality in first-run syndicated television, along with multiple Emmy nominations the same year. In 2016, Guinness World Records formally recognized Star Trek as the most successful science fiction television franchise in the world, and in 2024, the franchise as a whole received a Peabody Institutional Award, honoring the entire body of work for its lasting influence on media and culture. It's a strange but fitting contradiction. A franchise that has been formally banned, censored, and restricted by broadcasters on multiple continents has also become one of the most decorated science fiction properties in television history. Both things are true for the exact same reason. Star Trek was willing to take risks that plenty of other shows wouldn't touch. None of the episodes on this list were banned because they were badly made or pointless. They were restricted precisely because they worked, because a story about feral, dying children genuinely unsettled viewers, because a kiss between 2 characters of different races actually meant something in 1968, and because a descent into madness on a prison planet was disturbing enough that censors decided children shouldn't see it unsupervised. Star Trek set out from its very first pitch meeting to smuggle difficult, uncomfortable truths about humanity past network executives by wrapping them in strange planets and stranger aliens. Every so often, that strategy worked a little too well, and the result ended up locked in a vault for 20 or 30 years instead of a television schedule. What's most interesting, looking back at all of this decades later, isn't just that these episodes were pulled. It's that so many of them still hold up as genuinely effective, unsettling television, long after the special effects and production values of the era have started to show their age. That a testament to how much of the horror in these episodes was never really about gore or spectacle in the first place. It was about ideas, about what happens to society when everyone in charge suddenly dies, about what it costs a captor to dehumanize a captive, about how thin the line really is between a brilliant leader and a dangerous one. Those ideas were uncomfortable enough on their own to get a show banned from a national broadcaster. No aliens required. So, what do you think? Should any of these episodes have been kept off the air, or were the broadcasters simply too cautious for the era they were living in? Let us know in the comments below. And if stories like these interest you, stick around. There's a lot more hidden Star Trek history where this came from. Science fiction has always been a safe place to say dangerous things. Wrap a hard truth in a rubber-forehead alien or a planet full of strange customs, and suddenly a network will let you talk about war, race, sex, and sanity on primetime television. Star Trek built an entire 50-year empire on that trick. But every so often, the disguise wasn't good enough. A story would come along that was simply too raw, too violent, or too uncomfortable for a broadcaster's stomach, and that episode would quietly disappear from the schedule, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. Today, we're counting down 3 episodes of the original Star Trek series that were pulled, restricted, or refused a broadcast slot by censors. And once you know what's actually in them, you'll understand exactly why. Stick around, because by the end of this video, we're also going to look at how one science fiction show from the 1960s built enough cultural weight to shape real spaceflight, real medicine, and real civil rights history, and why that same boldness is what got it banned in the first place. Let's start with an episode that looks, on the surface, like a fairly ordinary Star Trek mystery. The USS Enterprise picks up a distress signal from a planet that, according to their sensors, is an almost exact physical twin of Earth. Kirk assembles a landing party. Himself, Spock, Dr. McCoy, Yeoman Janice Rand, and a couple of security officers. And they beam down expecting to find another human settlement in trouble. What they find instead is worse. The town is deserted. Storefronts sit untouched, as if the people who live there simply vanished mid-afternoon. It has the eerie, frozen in amber look of a mid-century American street that time forgot. That silence is broken almost immediately by a shrieking, badly disfigured man who lunges at the away team, collapses into convulsions, and dies right in front of them before anyone can even ask him a question. The landing party isn't alone on this planet for long. A frightened young girl is watching them from the shadows, and once she works up the nerve to approach, she calls the crew grups. Her word, it turns out, for grown-ups, and not a friendly one. Her name is Miri, and she explains, in halting, childlike language, that she and a handful of other kids are the only people left alive on the planet. They call themselves the Onlys. The horror creeps in gradually from there. Miri tells a landing party that every adult on this world went through the same transformation before they died. Violent mood swings, mental collapse, and finally death, all triggered by strange blotches that appear on the skin. Almost immediately after she says this, the crew notices the same blotches starting to form on their own arms. Digging into an abandoned research facility, the away team uncovers the full and disturbing history of this planet. Centuries earlier, scientists here have been chasing a way to dramatically extend human lifespan. Whatever they created worked on children in a way nobody had predicted. Kids infected by the resulting virus stopped aging in any meaningful sense, drifting through puberty at the rate of a single month for every 100 years. But once those same children finally hit adolescence, the virus turned savage, driving them into psychosis and then killing them outright. The children running around this planet, still behaving and speaking like kids, are in fact hundreds of years old. And now the same countdown clock has started ticking on the entire landing party. McCoy throws himself into a race against time to synthesize a cure using the original research left behind in the lab. That race is nearly sabotaged by John, one of the oldest of the Onlys, who, driven by fear, distrust, and a very believable childhood instinct to protect his group from strange intruders, steals the crew's communicators and cuts them off from the ship, making it far harder to get equipment and information they desperately need. What follows is one of the more unsettling sequences in the entire original series. A mob of feral, half-panicked children, egged on by their own terror, swarming Kirk and beating him. It's disturbing specifically because it inverts the show's usual dynamic. Kirk isn't fighting a monster or an alien warlord. He's being physically overwhelmed by kids who are, emotionally at least, no older than 10 or 11. He only gets through to them by warning that the youngest of the Onlys will die helpless and alone if the older kids don't cooperate. John eventually returns the communicators. McCoy tests his vaccine on himself first, and against the clock, the cure works. British broadcasters were not comfortable with what they'd aired. Miri ran once on the BBC and immediately drew a wave of television franchise. The show's most famous line, "To boldly go where no man has gone before," wasn't even entirely original to Roddenberry. It echoed language from a U.S. government pamphlet on space exploration published in the years following the launch of Sputnik, and Roddenberry folded that Cold War-era optimism directly into his opening narration. The technological influence runs deep and specific. Engineers working on some of the earliest handheld communication devices have pointed to the show's flip-open communicators as a direct visual influence on early mobile phone design. The concept of the tricorder, a handheld device capable of scanning and mapping unfamiliar environments, was cited by one of the key technologists behind Google Earth as an inspiration for the mapping software that eventually became that product. A nonprofit even launched a real-world competition in the 2010s challenging engineers to build a functioning medical tricorder, offering prize money to teams that could get closest to the fictional device's diagnostic capabilities. NASA itself named its very first prototype Space Shuttle Enterprise in 1976, a decision driven largely by an organized letter-writing campaign from fans of the show, a rare case of science fiction fandom directly influencing what a real spacecraft will be called. The social impact might be even more significant than the technological one. The original series put a multiracial, multinational bridge crew on American television at a time when that alone was a genuinely contentious decision for network executives. A Japanese helmsman, a Russian navigator during the height of Cold War tension, and an African-American woman, Lieutenant Uhura, serving as a senior communications officer on the ship's bridge. Actress Nichelle Nichols, who played Uhura, has spoken publicly over the years about a pivotal conversation she had with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. after she told Roddenberry she was planning to leave the series. King reportedly told her that Star Trek was one of the only shows he allowed his own children to watch, and urged her to stay because of the importance of what her character represented on screen. She stayed, and later went on to work directly with NASA on astronaut recruitment efforts, helping bring some of the first women and people of color into the American space program during the late 1970s and 1980s. Even in the 21st century, the franchise's fingerprints keep showing up in unexpected places. The U.S. government's accelerated COVID-19 vaccine development program was named Operation Warp Speed, a title suggested by a Star Trek fan working within the federal health agency responsible for approving the resulting vaccines. It's a strange, almost funny footnote, but it says something about how deeply this franchise's language and imagery have soaked into everyday culture decades after its first cancellation. All of that context matters, because it explains exactly why the censorship fights on this list happened in the first place. A show with as much cultural ambition, made by a creator that's determined to slip hard subjects past network gatekeepers, was never going to have a spotless broadcast history. Let's look at a few more episodes that ran into exactly that wall. Of the handful of original series episodes that face an outright broadcast ban in Britain, The Empath is often singled out by critics and historians as the most genuinely disturbing of the bunch, and unlike some of the others on this list, it earns that reputation almost entirely through suggestion rather than graphic imagery. The premise strands the Enterprise crew on a dying planet inhabited by a coldly clinical alien species, conducting an experiment in psychology. Their subject of interest is Jem, a mute alien woman with the ability to absorb the physical pain and injuries of others into her own body, healing them at direct cost to herself. The aliens running the experiment aren't interested in Jem's abilities out of curiosity. They're testing whether her species is capable enough of empathy and self-sacrifice to be worth preserving after their own world is destroyed, and they're willing to torture members of the Enterprise crew, one after another, to force that test to a conclusion. Much of what happens on screen is implied rather than shown outright. Injuries are described more than depicted. Suffering is conveyed through performance and dialogue rather than special effects. That restraint is exactly why the episode has aged as well as it has. Audiences feel in the horror themselves, which tend to be far more effective than anything a 1960s television budget could have shown directly. The BBC ultimately judged this one too intense a broadcast at all, folding it into the same batch of restricted episodes as Miri, Plato's Stepchildren, and Whom Gods Destroy, citing the same concerns about madness, torture, and disease that were used to justify the other bans on this list. American critical reaction, by contrast, was largely positive, with many fans and reviewers praising the episode's emotional weight and its thoughtful handling of sacrifice and suffering. That gap between the American and British reception fueled years of petitions from UK fans asking the BBC to finally release the withheld episodes. But the network held its position for a remarkably long time. British audiences didn't get an official broadcast of The Empath until 1994, nearly 30 years after the episode originally aired in the United States. Not every banned or restricted Star Trek episode came from the original 1960s series. Star Trek, The Next Generation, generally remembered as a more measured, cerebral show than its predecessor, produced one first-season episode that pushed graphic horror further than almost anything else in the franchise's history. Conspiracy centers on a parasitic alien species that has been secretly infiltrating high-ranking officers throughout Starfleet Command, using them as unwitting hosts to slowly seize control of the Federation from the inside. When Picard and Riker finally corner an infected officer, Lieutenant Commander Remick, the confrontation ends with a special effects sequence that still shocks first-time viewers decades later. Remick's head is destroyed by a sustained phaser blast, achieved on a 1980s television budget, using real meat and prosthetic effects, followed immediately by a grotesque, insect-like parasite creature bursting out of his ruined chest cavity in full view of the camera. It's a genuinely startling sequence, closer in tone to 80s body horror cinema than anything else in the Star Trek catalog, and the reaction from broadcasters reflected that. NBC opted to push the episode to a later 10 p.m. time slot specifically to limit the number of younger viewers likely to see it, and Canadian broadcasters attached a content warning before it aired. British broadcasters went further and simply declined to air it at all, citing the graphic nature of practical effects as too much for the network standards. Even today, it's remembered by longtime fans as one of the most genuinely shocking single scenes a franchise ever produced. Not every episode on a list like this was formally banned outright. Some face a quieter, more localized form of resistance instead. Star Trek, Deep Space Nine Rejoined is one of those cases. The episode as a whole aired without incident across most of the country, but several television distributors in the American South refused to broadcast it unless a specific scene was removed first. That scene featured what was at the time the franchise's first same-sex kiss, a brief and understated moment between two women that some regional broadcasters worried would provoke backlash from more conservative viewers in their markets. The story surrounding that moment is more thoughtful than the controversy suggests. It follows Lieutenant Commander Jadzia Dax, a member of the Trill species who carries a symbiont organism that had previously lived inside another host decades earlier. When that former host's widow arrives on the station, old feelings resurface between them. Feelings are considered deeply taboo within Trill culture, since reunited with a previous host spouse violates a long-standing social prohibition. The episode never treats the characters' attraction to each other as a problem. The conflict is entirely about the weight of cultural expectation bearing down on two people who still love each other. Critics responded warmly to the episode's handling of the subject, praising the writing and performances and the willingness to engage with LGBTQ+ themes on mainstream television in 1995, a period when that kind of representation was still exceedingly rare. Terry Farrell, the actress who played Dax, has spoken about the episode fondly in interviews over the years, calling it one of the most meaningful installments of her time on the show. Despite the acclaim, some regional broadcasters held firm and continued airing edited versions of the episode with the kiss removed, a reminder that even praised, celebrated television could still run into resistance simply for depicting a same-sex relationship with dignity. Deep Space Nine's fourth season episode, To the Death, never faced an outright ban, but it holds a different distinction. It's generally regarded as the first Star Trek episode censored specifically for excessive on-screen violence, rather than for thematic content like madness or sexuality. The plot put Sisko and his crew in an uneasy, temporary alliance with a group of Jem'Hadar soldiers, forcing them to fight their way through a network of dangerous caves to reach and destroy a powerful ancient gateway before it can fall into hostile hands. The battle that follows is almost entirely hand-to-hand, brutal and sustained, and the original cut of the episode reportedly included somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 Jem'Hadar and several unnamed Starfleet personnel being killed on screen. Before American broadcasters would clear the episode for air, roughly 45 seconds were trimmed from that sequence, cutting the visible death toll down significantly and softening some of the episode's more chaotic, high-intensity beats. British standards proved even stricter. When the episode reached the UK for an early evening broadcast slot, the BBC required additional cuts on top of the ones already made for American television. Ironically, the end result satisfied almost nobody. Fans who watched the heavily trimmed UK version complained not that it was too violent, but that the aggressive editing had made the fight sequence feel choppy, disjointed, and hard to follow, stripping out context along with the violence itself. It's a good example of how far a network's caution can sometimes swing past the point of usefulness, damaging the storytelling without actually making the episode subjects the BBC felt were simply unfit for a program still widely regarded as family or children's viewing. There was an added wrinkle for this particular episode. 2. A suggestive dance performed by one of the inmates, an Orion-inspired character named Marta, was specifically flagged by censors as too overtly sexual for what they still classified as children's programming. Between the graphic violence, the psychological cruelty, and that dance sequence, Whom Gods Destroy ended up staying off British airwaves for roughly a quarter of a century, only finally reaching UK audiences in 1994. So there you have it. 3 episodes of show about peaceful exploration that were each judged independently to be too disturbing for broadcast. But bans like these weren't some strange fluke. They were almost a natural consequence of what Star Trek was actually trying to do from day one. Let's talk about how a show built around handshakes with aliens ended up this fearless. To understand why Star Trek kept running into trouble with censors, you have to understand what creator Gene Roddenberry was actually trying to build. What started in 1966 as a single television series about the crew of the starship USS Enterprise has since grown into one of the largest and most enduring franchises in entertainment history, spanning more than a dozen television series, 13 feature films, hundreds of novels, comics, video games, and a fan culture so devoted it developed a fully functional constructed language for a fictional alien race. The original show only lasted 3 seasons on NBC before it was canceled, a fact that feels almost impossible given everything that came after. Syndication saved it. Reruns introduced the series to a much larger audience than its initial broadcast ever reached, and that audience refused to let it die. An animated continuation followed in the 1970s, and then 6 feature films brought the original cast back together across the following 2 decades. In the late 1980s, Star Trek. The Next Generation introduced an entirely new crew and a new Enterprise, launching an era that would eventually include Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and a prequel series called Enterprise, each one exploring a different corner or a different time period of the same shared universe. The franchise got a cinematic reboot in 2009 with a new cast playing younger versions of the original characters in an alternate timeline. And starting in 2017, a wave of streaming-era shows pushed the universe even further outward, both centuries before Kirk's Enterprise and centuries beyond it. None of that longevity happened by accident, and it definitely wasn't because the show played it safe. From the very beginning, Roddenberry pitched Star Trek to network executives using deliberately unthreatening comparisons. He famously described as a wagon train to the stars, borrowing the shape of a popular Western series to make a science fiction pitch feel more familiar and less risky. Privately, though, his real influences ran in a very different direction. He often cited Gulliver's Travels as inspiration, a satire that used fantastical lands and creatures to smuggle sharp social commentary past readers who thought they were just enjoying an adventure story. That's precisely the trick Roddenberry built into every episode of Star Trek, an entertaining adventure on the surface, and a pointed moral argument underneath it. That structure let the show tackle subjects that would have been flatly rejected if pitched as a straightforward drama. Stories about racism became stories about warring aliens with faces painted half black and half white. Stories about the Cold War became conflicts between the Federation and hostile empires with clear political parallels. Stories about religious dogma, about class divides, about the ethics of new technology, all of it got filtered through alien cultures and distant planets, which gave Roddenberry enormous latitude to say things that network censors might have blocked if the show had been set in present-day America. He said as much himself over the years. Putting a controversial idea on a fictional planet let him sneak difficult conversations about real politics and real prejudice past executives who were mostly focused on ratings. The optimism baked into the show was just as deliberate as the social commentary. Roddenberry wanted Star Trek to imagine a future where humanity had actually learned from its worst mistakes rather than simply repeating them on a bigger stage. The Vulcans are probably the clearest expression of that idea, a species with violent, war-torn history that consciously chose logic and emotional discipline over aggression and built a stable, thriving civilization as a result. The United Federation of Planets itself was conceived as an idealized, functioning version of the United Nations, a coalition of wildly different worlds that had figured out how to cooperate instead of fight. None of this sat comfortably with network executives who were nervous about ratings rather than ideals, and Roddenberry